some creepy 4chan horror stories. Last night's phone call. I just want to tell somebody this story. It fits here, I think. You'll see why I really can't tell my husband. So, my husband, let's call him Joe. Joe has been an attorney for about 12 years. And for the past 6 years, he's been working as a public defender if the state appoints him to represent a criminal, or a criminal defense lawyer if a person hires him to represent a criminal. He specializes in, and therefore primarily does, appellate cases, and so most of his clients are convicted felons. Think what you want about what he does for a living, but I can tell you for sure he is a good guy with a strong belief that he's protecting all of our constitutional and human rights with the work he does. He's been spending a lot of time with his current client during this preparation phase of his case, and this means he has to spend a lot of time out of the prison. His client is a high-profile felon, twice convicted of a capital murder. If I said his name, you would know who he was, and then could easily figure out who my husband is too, so I'm going to leave it at that. Regardless, this guy is on death row, awaiting execution for 2 capital murders. But unlike the great majority of his past clients, my husband believes this man is 100% innocent. His client was convicted of killing an acquaintance and her son. There wasn't any physical evidence of the crime to speak of. In fact, the prosecution could never even locate a crime scene, other than a few strands of hair and several minuscule drops of blood. The primary evidence used to convict my husband's client was all circumstantial. Some emails, a couple of past incident reports involving my husband's client and the victim, a theoretical timeline established by some sketchy eyewitness accounts, video surveillance at a gas station a few blocks from the location where the remains of the victims were finally found, and a 911 call from an unidentified male on the night the prosecution alleges the crime was committed. That's shaky evidence at best. But when the person is an ethnic minority in a pro-capital punishment state, you'd be amazed how little the DA sometimes needs to convince 12 people to send somebody to the gas chamber. To be clear, my husband Joe isn't gullible. He's probably the smartest person I know, and he is well aware that most of his clients are actually guilty of the crimes they have been convicted of. In fact, this is only the 3rd time in his career he believes he is defending a totally innocent man. So with such a high-profile client and an appeal that will hopefully end with the freedom of a wrongly convicted man, for Joe, this case is a career changer. A life changer, really. He has put everything he has into it, sacrificed so much, and to free an innocent man from prison and save his life. This would validate every belief Joe has ever had about himself and why it is so important that he's doing the work he does. This is one of the reasons that I'm feeling so anxious about what happened last night, and the main reason that I can't say anything to him about what happened. When my husband makes the drive home from the prison, usually he leaves there at about 10 p.m. and it takes a little over an hour to get home. We talk on the phone, he calls me as he's driving away, and we stay on the phone together as he goes through whatever drive-thru he's getting his dinner at, and then all the way until he parks the car in our garage. Normally, we don't talk about his case. We just talk about regular life stuff. What should I get at the store tomorrow? I gotta tell you what my sister said. Why is this stupid lawn dying? You know, stuff like that. It's a nice way for him to unwind from the day, I think. Usually when he calls, I'm already in bed. But I had a pretty tough day at work yesterday, and I had a pounding headache when I got home. I didn't even feel like eating. After I changed into my sweats, I took 4 Advil with a glass of wine. I know, don't do that. And then I got in bed and turned on the TV. I probably fell asleep around 9, and when the phone rang at 5 to 11, it woke me up. My phone said, "Love of my life, cell." That's his personal cell phone. But I knew it was Joe without having to read it. When he said hi, his voice sounded a little hoarse. A little tired too. But since he was leaving so late, it made sense. He asked me if he woke me up. I lied and said no. He said I sounded really sleepy. I told him he sounded weird too. But then he changed the subject. For some reason, he wanted to talk about the case. He said, "I saw the photos of the crime scene today. Victim 1 and Victim 2. There was just so much blood." Now, Joe has a dry sense of humor. Like I said before, the bodies of the two of the victims had never been recovered, just some bones and bone fragments. Joe has sometimes joked that he's worried that, quote, "the secret photos of his clients drenched in blood and holding the heads of his victims." The Me speculated that from some of the marks on the bones, both victims had been decapitated, will show up in the judge's morning mail. So he knows that I know that there are no photos of the crime scene or the victims. "Yeah, right," I said. He was joking, of course. "I bet you found the knife too." "You mean the axe?" "Nobody will ever find that axe." He laughed a little. A little morbid humor is sometimes what keeps things sane when you work for convicted felons. "How far away are you?" I started to ask, but he interrupted me. I remember exactly what he said too, and today I can't get it out of my head. "You know, that first swing at her, the boy tried to grab the blade to stop it mid-swing. Can you imagine? Like little 12-year-old fingers are going to stop the blade of an axe in mid-swing. It was probably a good thing that he went into shock when his fingers came off, though. Made it a lot easier on everybody. It takes a lot of chops to actually get somebody's head off." Even for Joe, I thought this was overboard. I'd never heard him talk like this, and especially about this case. His statement was shocking. It sent a shiver up my spine, but then I thought about it. Stress and work exhaustion can make people do and say strange things, and I know that Joe has been under a huge amount of stress lately and has been working nonstop for months. So instead of reacting to what he said, I reacted to what I thought he was feeling. "It's okay, Joe. It's going to be over soon," I said. "And then we'll go to our beach house just like we planned and spend at least 2 weeks remembering what life is supposed to be like, right? We bought a wreck of a beach house about 3 years ago and have yet to spend any real time there. Joe and I both looking forward to fixing it up." I heard him inhale, jagged breaths, as if he was about to start crying. I said something like, "He's an innocent man, Joe, and you are saving his life by proving it. Your case is solid. You know the truth." I really wanted him to remember that. I thought it would help. Joe didn't really respond, so I thought it was a good time to change the subject. "So, are you gonna stop tonight?" I asked him. "I'm never going to stop," he whispered. And then I heard the garage door open, which made me jump practically out of my skin. "You're here already," I said into the phone. There's no way he got here so fast, but the call had ended. I heard the back door open and the sound of footsteps coming towards the bedroom. I would be lying if I said that, considering everything, I wasn't afraid. When Joe opened the door, I felt a huge amount of relief at the sight of him, but I was confused, especially considering how he sounded on the phone. He didn't look sad, he didn't look tired, and he didn't look stressed. In fact, he was happier than I think I've ever seen him. He sat beside me on the edge of the bed and hugged me tight as he told me the case was over. The new AG wasn't even going to go through with the trial. In a deal Joe had made just that evening, the state is allowing his client to plead guilty to second-degree murder and commuting his death sentence. Considering time served and his client's good behavior, Joe thinks he'll be out of jail in just a couple of weeks. It's over. Joe won. But the phone? I started to ask him. He told me his work cell was dead. He forgot the charger at the office. While he was hammering out the details of the new agreement with the AG at the prison, he gave his personal cell to his client to play a game. With all the excitement, Joe accidentally left his cell phone with his client and only realized it when it was too late to go back and get it. No big deal, he said. He'll get it tomorrow. Then he said he was sorry for not calling me. The following information is now almost impossible to find due to media blackouts and censorship efforts launched by the British government. I am able to relay it purely because I had taken copious notes in a loose leaf notebook and was prepared to flee my residence within minutes of deeming it necessary. The events described below have been heavily investigated by members of an online community that is no longer in existence, and have been confirmed by multiple sources. In most instances, the sources of the information were posting on social media websites. These postings rarely stayed up for more than an hour, and after the first day of the event, were likely being removed automatically by programs presumably set up by the government. In cases where the sources was different, I have specified its origin. Numerous details surrounding this story have been left out due to a lack of multiple sources. And I guess that's just the author of this 4chan thread and what he said. And then he continues saying, on July 27th, 2013, at around 11 a.m., a large portion of the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland was cordoned off by the British military. The consensus is that the epicenter of this containment effort was a small patch of forest, 2.3 miles southwest of Bainbrecke Mountain, at the coordinates of, I'm not going to read those out, but just coordinates. The first sign that this was taking place was when a man walking his dogs through the park saw a military transport helicopter flying above the tree canopy. 15 minutes later, a couple out for a hike spotted British soldiers moving through a patch of forest some distance from them. They described the troops as moving fast, heavily armed, and with their faces covered. The soldiers did not notice the couple and appeared focused on the woods. Around 11:30 a.m., British soldiers began actively and aggressively removing people from the park. The removal efforts were well outside of the epicenter of containment, suggesting that the British military was evacuating as many people from the park as possible. Soldiers driving battery-powered all-terrain vehicles, silent except for the sound of their tires rolling over the forest floor, picked up any civilians they saw. The civilians were then driven out of the park. The soldiers explained nothing, except that a training mission was in progress and that they were being evacuated for their safety. Civilians being driven out said the soldiers, clutching their weapons and staring into the forest, looked unusually guarded for a training mission. The reason for the containment, as it is now known with a considerable degree of certainty, was the presence of a, quote, humanoid entity within the forest. The first civilian sighting of this entity was made by a woman who had been birdwatching with a land telescope from the face of Ben Avon Mountain. She saw a transport helicopter land in a field a mile or two from the base of the mountain, then saw troops get out of the helicopter and move to the forest. Later, the woman was scanning the tree lines of the surrounding forest when she, by chance, spotted what she described as a naked, pale, skinned person. The person moved bizarrely with a kind of over-exaggerated upright posture and with very slow and smooth body movements. Specific details of the entity's physical appearance were impossible to make out due to the distance. She reported that the thing eventually disappeared into the woods. The second sighting was on the bank of a small river called the Derry Burn. Two older men were walking to a fishing spot when they spotted a, quote, red-faced thing in the woods on the other side of the river. They said it looked like a person with white skin wearing a mask made of red jade. The thing was staring at the bark of a tree, perfectly still, and with childlike curiosity. The men watched it for some time, keeping as quiet as possible. At some point, the entity became aware of them. It rotated its head towards them in a manner that unsettled the two men. They described it as like a head on a rotating plate, all the while keeping its body still. For the brief few seconds, the men were staring face to face with the entity. Both remarked that as soon as the entity looked at them, they were overwhelmed by the stench of burning plastic. They quickly dropped their fishing equipment and ran. These men did not describe their encounter on social media. Rather, they went to a bar they frequented and told it to the bartender there, who then posted the story in the miscellaneous forum on bodybuilding. in a thread that grew to 8 pages in 20 hours. Like I said earlier, there was a group investigating all of this, but this group did not exist in the first few days per se. There were people posting in threads on different forums, and there were curious people here and there digging up what they could, but none of us had come together yet and actually organized. One of those guys, who eventually became a member of this group, had a friend in the Royal Air Force. He had known this friend long before the park was locked down. This friend, a few days after the lockdown took place, relayed him a story. The friend and his fellow RAF personnel were ordered, the same day the force was locked down, to clear the runway they were stationed at, in order to host aircraft coming in from different bases. Military jets landed throughout the day to refuel, with no markings indicating their base of origin. The pilots flying them were described by airbase personnel as cold and untalkative, and they rarely left their cockpits. The purpose of these aircraft became apparent in the evening. When the RAF began bombing areas of the park, the bombings were not acknowledged by the government and were not reported by any media source. I know I sound crazy claiming this. Much of the information on the bombings actually comes from a thread on Jeep forum, strangely enough. Off-road enthusiasts with Jeeps had been in the area when everything started. These folks had encountered British troops earlier in the day and were told to leave the area immediately, which they did. However, they stuck around near the edge of the park, hoping to witness something exciting. They saw nothing, but at around 7 p.m., they heard what sounded like a deep clap of thunder off in the distance. There were no clouds in the sky, so they thought the sound was suspicious. They drove to higher grounds in the hopes of seeing something, but saw only a hint of light smoke drifting off the trees far away. Nothing could be seen definitively due to the distance. A series of explosions were then heard around 7:20 p.m. An American tourist staying at a bed and breakfast in Kingreg, northwest of the epicenter, had been hiking along B970 when he heard it. It came from far off in the park. He described it as a series of rapid explosions. This same series of explosives was heard by a teenager who had been chopping wood in his backyard nearby. A few civilians contacted the authorities to find out if they had any information on the noises. They were told by police that what they heard was probably a, quote, mining excavation or a thunderstorm over the mountain. This despite everyone having reported cloudless skies throughout the day. Further calls to the authorities on the subject were ignored, and the media made no effort to investigate the explosions. If this seems unlikely, remember that the British government is more than capable of orchestrating media blackouts, and has done so for things far more significant. The UK is also one of the most CCTV watched countries on Earth, with one camera for every 11 people. The police can arrest you for appearing in public with someone they told you not to. The people in charge of the country are more than capable of suppressing information. Still, for the first few days, most of the internet communities discussing the event were safe, except for those on major social media websites. The day after all this happened, a no-fly zone was issued over the park. This declaration was not made public. It was only noticed when someone on Jeep forum investigated the area using flight radar and saw no flights coming within 10 miles of the place. One of the members on the forum called the Department of Transportation and asked if a no-fly zone had been issued. He was smart enough to do this from a payphone, and with a subtle disguise on that would make identifying him on CCTV difficult. Upon mentioning the park and the no-fly zone, he was politely asked to remain on hold. He put the phone down, off the hook, and walked about a block away to observe the phone booth from a distance. His suspicions were vindicated a few minutes later, when 2 black unmarked cars pulled up to the payphone. He said intimidating-looking men, not wearing anything that would identify them as law enforcement, exited the vehicles and began approaching the payphone. He fled as soon as he saw them. We assumed that, whatever happened, could embarrass the British government if it was made public, but wasn't so serious that we were in danger for talking about it. The spottings of the red-faced person had been known to us, but we didn't take them seriously during the first few days. We all just assumed the whole thing was some political bullshit. Then, certain eyewitnesses to the events were quietly arrested. 1 or 2 of the arrests were described in local news sources, but for the most part, the arrests were inferred based on happenings on social media. In the few instances where the arrest was discussed in the news, it was stated that the individual was arrested for either possession of drugs or for committing undisclosed white-collar crimes. Profiles on sites such as Facebook and Twitter were also being deleted, not just of the folks arrested, but of their family members. Many of the arrests seemed strange given the nature of the people arrested. People, for example, were being arrested for large-scale drug possession, despite a history of absolutely no drug use according to their friends and family. Then the threads on Jeep Forum and bodybuilding both disappeared. Anyone attempting to revive the discussions was banned. Some of the major folks involved in the discussion managed to get in touch with each other, using email addresses that could be found on archived copies of the forums. With the help of a tech-savvy member, we eventually established a low-key private forum to talk about what happened. Things were quiet for the next few months. We tried to work out what happened and find evidence supporting all the claims made. It was exciting, you know? One member of the community had a large real-life social network and was trying to find anyone who might have information on what happened. Somehow, he said it was through an acquaintance in a government office he was put into contact with someone. The contact was out of the country and refused to reveal his location. The only communication he had with this individual was in the form of a single long email that was sent from a cryptic email address. The story told in the email was far more bizarre than anything heard yet. However, it included explanations for many of the things observed, and minor aspects of the story were confirmed by our own research. The majority of the members of our group, after much internal debate, came to accept the story as true. This anonymous contact, who used the alias Brown, claimed that the military lockdown of Cairngorms National Park was due to an emergency in a clandestine underground laboratory. Brown was a member of a two-man response team sent by the military to investigate the emergency. Brown thought it was strange that only 2 men would be sent to investigate, and came up with, as he was being driven to the lab, 2 reasons why the military would do it. One was that the military knew there was no threats within the lab and simply wanted to scout it with a small team. The other was that the military knew there was a major threat in the lab and saw these 2 men as disposable. Upon entering the facility, he assumed a third option, that only 2 men were sent because the military planned on killing them afterwards to keep the lab a secret. Brown described the lab as sleek and high-tech, with shiny blue-gray tiles covering the walls and floors. Most of the desks they encountered housed state-of-the-art computer technology. He saw it looked like it was from 50 years in the future. The team was told to recover hard drives, files, and notebooks containing information on Project Centaur. The nature of the project was not explained. They were given a map that highlighted offices and labs worth investigating. They were also told to approach the lower levels of the lab with caution and assess the status of certain test subjects located there. The facility had been constructed such that wireless communication was impossible from within, so the men had to periodically check in by using hard lines accessible from communication rooms. This gave them the freedom to explore and discuss what they were seeing without anyone eavesdropping. The men were not greeted by anyone. A security room near the entrance was empty. They went in and found a lunchroom where a sandwich sat half-eaten on a table. As they moved into the facility, they saw that the entire place was flashing red under the light of a silent emergency alarm. They encountered a body in an office off of the main hall. It was a lady in a chair who looked like a mannequin. Her legs were locked out as if the knee joints had been fused together. Her eyes were wide and looked leathery, like they had been boiled. Her face and lips were bright pink and appeared chemically burnt. The rest of her skin was a waxy gray and was charred in certain parts. Her veins had turned black and were easily visible under the skin. They noticed that she was still breathing. The topic of mercy killing her came up, but it was decided against, after realizing that whatever did this to her might come back and find her with a bullet wound, and thus be alerted to the 2 men's presence. Brown said that in retrospect, it was weird that they both assumed some sort of thing had done it, rather than say chemical exposure or radiation. For some reason, both men had assumed from the start that some kind of hostile thing was responsible for the lab's state. As they explored further, they found dozens of bodies in a similar state. Some were breathing lightly, but many were dead. Some of the bodies had disfiguring burn marks on their face, like they'd been burned with a clothes iron. On 2 occasions, they found a body that looked like it had been burned completely into stiff ash, all the way through, like a spent log in a fireplace. The 2 men headed deeper into the facility, collecting notebooks from offices and hard drives from computers. In the deepest layers of the facility, they found the test subjects they had been warned about. They were inside observation rooms, visible through thick glass windows. They were alive. Their faces were expressionless and black except for their noses, which were red. Their eyes looked sealed shut. They were shambling around like animals that had just been hit by a car. At this point, the J. Brown and his coworker abandoned all pretenses of professional coolness and began discussing freely what they were seeing. Both agreed that the government had crossed some kind of ethical line. They decided to read over the notebooks they had collected so far, to try and figure out what happened. They looked over the files they had taken. They only learned general information on Project Centaur that involved slicing human DNA with segments of artificial DNA that contained unnatural base pairs. Base pairs are what make up DNA. The 2 men decided that the main lab at the deepest point of the facility would likely contain more information. They made their way to the depths of the underground structure, where they found a large biomedical laboratory. As they explored the lab, they came across 2 vats, large enough to fit a standing person. Both vats were open. One had been fractured open, with glass shards sprawled on the floor in front, while the other had its lids ripped off and thrown across the lab. They found no dead scientists. The floor, however, was covered in burn marks, and in certain parts melted, and one of the burn marks vaguely resembled the outline of a person. Additionally, both men noticed the lab was filled with the smell of burnt plastic. They gathered up notebooks from the laboratory. These contained far more detailed information on what had happened. In particular, a document resembling a great proposal provided a solid backstory. With all the information they had, they were able to piece together the origins of the research being done. It began with a financial analyst working for the Bank of England, who started without any apparent reason to have hallucinogenic visions of a reoccurring pattern. He saw the pattern visually. It resembled what a person sees if they press on their closed eyes. He was experienced in mathematics and saw the details of these visions with unnatural clarity, and so was able to take these visions and express them numerically. He noticed that the pattern was composed of 4 repeating values, which, on a hunch, he believed correlated to the 2 base pairs of human DNA. When he compared his pattern to the human DNA sequence, he found that it matched certain key segments of the human genome, only slightly altered. His visions, in summary, were of altered fragments of human DNA. The results floored him. He began to analyze further. He found that when he incorporated the fragments into a complete genome using generic human DNA from the Human Genome Project, the result was 98.7% human. Chimpanzee DNA, for reference, is about 98% human. This genome, however, was not closer to chimpanzees. It was more distant. It was, if you will excuse me for saying, different in the other direction. His visionary genome, in certain instances, contained base pairs that were not one of the 2 that exist in nature. They were unnatural base pairs. Unnatural base pairs have been synthesized in laboratories, but obviously never found in nature. His vision gave no indication as to which base pair was required, but he was convinced that God had contacted him and had given him the recipe for perfecting mankind. Finding the right combination, therefore, was inevitable. He approached biologists from different universities, professors working in the field of synthetic biology, and spared them nothing of his theories. At this point, believed himself a prophet and assumed any who heard him would instantly recognize the importance of his task and lend him their help. One of the professors contacted the authorities immediately after the man dropped by and left his office. he assumed he was mentally insane. The financial analyst was taken into police custody. Eventually, he was subject to medical testing, where doctors found numerous small tumors in his optical lobe. His employment at the Bank of England was terminated, and he was supposedly transported to a 24/7 medical facility to receive specialized care. The man's fate is unknown. The government, for whatever reason, began to research his work. Apparently, they were as dumbfounded as the whole situation as anyone would be. They planned to introduce the described alterations into human DNA and observe what effects it had. Altering human DNA was, according to these documents, easy. Scientists could engineer a series of viruses to deliver the altered DNA to every human cell in the body. The only difficulty was deciding which unnatural base pairs to include. The government researchers had no leads, so they simply began trying different unnatural base pairs, hoping one would eventually work. They decided to test these viruses in living human subjects. The first few tests were catastrophic. Subjects who were injected with the cocktail began to suffer extreme reactions to the DNA-altering infection. Their bodies seemed to fall apart, skin blistered and sloughed off. Lymphatic fluid leaked from every square inch of skin. Organs failed in tandem. The initial test subjects all died within an hour of being injected. As the researchers experimented with different unnatural base pairs, they found formulations that kept subjects alive for longer. The subjects spotted in the observation room were created as a result of these formulations. In the most recent test, the human subjects showed new changes. They suffered far less during the infection when compared to the previous tests, and were described as having red faces, rather than black ones as the previous subjects had. These were the test subjects that were missing from the person-sized vats. These two red-faced test subjects were being grown or altered or whatever when the emergency happened. That was the last bit of information the two men were able to extract from the notebooks recovered in the lab. Curiously, one of the lab notebooks appeared to have had its last pages ripped out. With their mission complete, the two men headed out into the surface. The military took them into their possession along with the materials they had found. The two men were separated. Jay Brown was subject to a hostile interrogation. He said that he remained calm and disinterested throughout it, hoping that his interrogators would assume he was unaffected and uninterested in what he had seen. The interrogation process lasted nearly a day. Afterwards, Brown was moved to a high-security military base. He was not put in a jail cell, but he was blocked from communicating with anyone outside, and his movements about the base were restricted. Fortunately for Brown, somebody at the base was familiar to him. It was a friend with whom he had served in Afghanistan. More importantly, Brown had saved his friend's life in Afghanistan. He called in a favor, and the friend obliged him by smuggling him out of the building during the night. Brown fled the British Isles, and then the Western world in general. When the story was relayed to our forum, no one believed it. Still, we didn't have much to keep ourselves busy with, so a handful of members took to investigating certain facts. The original email gave the actual name of the financial analyst from the Bank of England, the one who had the visions. It was decided that, as a good starting place, we would try and track down this individual and confirm his existence. Typing his name into a search engine yielded nothing noteworthy, so we got creative. It was assumed that since he was working at a prestigious financial institution, he likely was a talented student and had probably attended a high-ranking secondary school and university. If his existence had been wiped from the internet, which a lot of us assumed was the case, we could still contact someone he had gone to school with and get a confirmation from them. A list of potential schools was drawn up. We decided to look at secondary schools, since it's far too easy for someone to attend a university without being known to the wider student body. Secondary schools, on the other hand, almost everyone is at least somewhat aware of everyone else's existence. People began calling secondary schools on our short list. After a number of unsuccessful calls, someone called a day trader who had attended Warwick School and had a reputation for a talent in math. The day trader's voice lit up at the very mention of the financial analyst's name. They had indeed gone to school together, he confirmed, and the analyst had been a prodigious student with high accolades. The person who made the call considered it a success. Before he could end the call, though, the day trader said something else. He had been contacted by the police a few weeks ago. The police warned the day trader that someone may call in the future and ask about the financial analyst, and that if anyone does, he must deny having known him and then contact the police immediately. This was a major breakthrough. It confirmed that the police were trying to suppress knowledge of the financial analyst and thus gave some weight to the ridiculous story of the underground lab. At this point, most of us had accepted P. Brown's story as accurate. Earlier, I mentioned that I was only going to describe events that had been verified by reliable sources. I feel that at least mentioning some of the unverified claims is necessary. They have been discussed and debated and researched heavily on our forum. And even though their credibility has not been proven, the simple fact that people were whispering them on our forum affected all of our perception of the event. Two stories in particular were considered nearly proven. The first one came from a man who had been biking through Carnegorm's Park the day the event took place. There are a number of facts that give this story credibility, but it had its doubters due to the nature by which it was known. It was relayed to us by an otherwise trusted member of our forum who said he read it on a post on the Jeep forums on the day that everything happened. Unfortunately, he had not taken any screen caps of the original post and said no evidence could be found in any archives. We had nothing but his word, which was enough for many, but not for all. The story is this: the biker claimed that as he was traveling down a trail, he was hit with the stench of burning plastic. He thought there was a fire somewhere, so he got off his bike and looked around. Eventually, he heard some rustling in the woods nearby. As he walked towards the source of the noise, he saw what he described as a group of deer lying on the forest floor, with their internal anatomy rearranged to make them bipedal. The deer, however, still seemingly had brains wired for quadrupedal motion, and thus could only flail around on the ground. The biker ran back to his bike as soon as he saw the deer and pedaled off. He hadn't brought his phone or any kind of camera with him, so he couldn't take pictures of what he had seen. This story almost definitely would have been considered canon, were it not for the fact that it was so unsubstantiated. The next story came from a man claiming to have been one of the soldiers who had evacuated the park. Not at all unbelievable, as there were a decent number of troops in the forest on that day, and it was likely some of them had loose lips. This man, however, made claims that had not been made anywhere else. Many in our group believed the story was made up. We were nearly split over it, and we killed many hours discussing it. I personally believe it is true. The soldier claimed that he was with 4 other soldiers, doing routine sweeps for civilians, when they spotted the test subject at the edge of a forest. The soldiers themselves were moving across a large grass field. The test subject was a few hundred yards away and not facing them. It was looking to their 10 o'clock, with its back facing them at an angle. As they approached it, the subject turned its head and looked at them, like in the story of the 2 old fishermen. The soldier claimed that as soon as it looked at them, they were overcome with the taste and stench of burning plastic. He described it as a person wearing a mask of red gemstone, with a sickly pale body that was almost see-through. The soldier was hit with a wave of intense fear, but forced himself to raise his weapon and approach the thing. They approached it slowly, without firing their weapons. After about 50 yards, the thing turned its body towards them and started walking. As soon as that happened, all 5 men stopped without a word. The soldier claimed that he was overcome with the understanding that he was not to move under any circumstances. He said it was like the freeze reflex, but totally unbreakable. He had been hit with the strange conviction that he'd be safe as long as he did not move. The thing continued to approach them. When it was within 100 yards, the soldier could see the details of its mask-like face. The eyes of it were closed, as was the mouth. The soldier said that at this point, he began to feel hotter, as if he were blushing and standing in front of an oven at the same time. Soon he felt like red-hot wires were being thread through his skin. The soldier was overcome with the knowledge that he would be safe despite the heat as long as he did not move. He was convinced that the damage was reversible, and that the way to reverse it was to not move. In retrospect, he realized this was ridiculous, and the heat was damaging his skin, and they all had burn marks after the encounter. The only reason he and his companions were alive was that the test subject got distracted when some animal ran through the woods behind it. The soldier heard the rustling, and presumably so did the test subject. It turned its head in a bizarre manner, like it was floating above its body, to look for the source of the noise. As soon as the thing looked away, some of the soldiers' freeze reflex lifted. It was still intense, but he was able to raise his weapon. His companions did likewise, and one of them fired off a round of bullets. The thing fled into the woods, dashing over 100 yards in what seemed like less than a second. The soldiers radioed in what had happened. They were then picked up and brought to a base. They were told that they had been exposed to an experimental deliriant, which had caused their hallucinations, the burning on their skin, and the sensation of being frozen. The soldier initially believed his superiors, despite having a suspicion about the whole thing. But he realized he had been lied to when he heard other accounts of the red-faced test subject. There are other unconfirmed stories, but there's a good chance they were simply made up. These two are the only that people really thought might be truthful. 2 weeks ago, the forum we had set up was shut down. As soon as I opened up the dead web page, I grabbed my emergency bag and left my apartment. I haven't gone back. Some of us more paranoid members had set up emergency communication plans we could use to stay in touch. If something like this were to happen, I tried making a few calls and sending a few emails, but I got no response. I'm trying to leave the British Isles. I plan to take a boat to continental Europe, then disappear in a former USSR country. I have no intention of continuing my involvement in this investigation. Good luck to anyone who wishes to continue where we left off. A few months ago, I was watching television in my living room when I heard the first howl. It reverberated through my bones like something from my darkest nightmares, leaving me temporarily immobile with the shock of it. After a few moments, I tried my best to regain my composure, reassuring myself with a forced laugh of self-depreciation that it was most likely just a stray dog or coyote. I told myself that it had just startled me with its suddenness. Nothing more. After all, I reasoned with myself. The mind likes to exaggerate things. The rest of the night passed without further events, and I went to sleep having all but forgotten. My dreams, however, were less forgiving. In them, I stumbled through darkened woods, heard echoing howls that seemed to come from every direction at once, was haunted by the feeling of piercing eyes following me at every moment. When I finally woke a short while before dawn, I was covered in sweat. A lingering unease clung to me until daybreak. The next few weeks were pretty uneventful. Rarely I would, on occasion, hear some strange sounds as if someone was walking in another room or on the porch, but nothing that I wasn't able to simply shrug off as my imagination. The worst thing that happened was a reoccurring dream similar to the first I'd had. I'd find myself walking down a dark stretch of country road located near my home at night. The dirt road stretched out in front of me, seemingly for an eternity, while the trees on either side formed a dense canopy that only allowed for a few stray shafts of moonlight to illuminate my way. As I walked onward, I would always hear movement to either side, just out of sight. I remember only on rare occasions catching a brief glimpse of silhouettes in the dark, but always, I could feel eyes on me. Aside from the occasional dreams, it was about a full month from the first night before I heard the howling again. This time, it was not singular, but a series of overlapping howls that gathered to form a melancholy crescendo. It seemed like the howls came from every direction at once and with such piercing clarity that I could have sworn the sources were almost on top of me. I was horrified. There was something that just felt fundamentally wrong about these howls. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, trying to will away the horrendous cacophony. I truly felt like I was going to be driven to pure insanity by the piercing sounds of it all. As embarrassing as it may be, I was in the fetal position rocking back and forth with my arms over my ears when the howling finally subsided. I was trembling from fear to the point where it must have taken me a full minute to even stand. Trembling, I made a quick lap through my house, shutting all of my curtains and ensuring that my doors were locked and deadbolted, never lingering by any of the windows for long. When I finally reached the sliding glass door leading to my back porch, I heard footsteps. I was just barely able to see the black silhouettes that broke up the faint glow of the moon on my porch. If I'd had the lights on in my room, I probably wouldn't have even noticed until I was only inches away. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone, all the while aware of the distinct sensation of their eyes upon me. I took one quick picture as my hands trembled, then slowly backed away, unable to stop gazing into those eyes, which burned like the coals of hell itself. Eventually, I inched back enough to duck into my hallway, sliding to the floor as fear took hold and drained the strength from my legs. With my back pressed to the wall, I fumbled for the hall light switch, part of me expecting to hear the telltale sound of breaking glass at any moment. Nothing. No glass breaking. No footsteps on the porch. Absolute silence filled the air. Not even the chirping of crickets reached my ears. Pulling out my cell phone and staring at the screen, not even daring to look at the picture I'd taken, my hand shook as I tried to figure out who to call. Who could I call? Ghostbusters? I whispered aloud to myself after a moment, trying to force myself to calm down with a bad joke. The cracked mockery of my voice that came out of my mouth only served to solidify my fear. I remember thinking about what I had just seen. Could I really call my friend, family member, or even the authorities? Even worse, the gate to the driveway was almost half a mile away, and I'd have to go to my car and drive the distance to let anyone in. In the end, I crept to the overside of the hall, cautiously entering my room and retrieving my CZ-52 pistol. I sure as hell wasn't going to look for a fight, but I decided that I wasn't about to die without one either. I ended up sitting there against the wall until morning, only mustering the strength to lean around the corner and look out the sliding glass door when the room was bright from the sun's rays. The porch was empty. With gun in hand, I made a few laps around the house, feeling slightly more confident with the comfort of the sun. The area was clear. I didn't even find any tracks. Over the next few weeks, I was haunted by the same dreams of being stalked as before. I could see the silhouetted figures more clearly in the trees now, as if they were getting closer. I could see the redness of their eyes reflecting in the pale light of the moon. They never howled in my dreams. They barely even made a sound as they crept along and shadowed my movements. A call to animal control revealed little except that a few people reported hearing howls as well. They said that it was normal of coyotes and that the light had played tricks on me. Unconvinced, I made a habit of locking and bolting my doors as soon as I got inside and was always indoors by dusk, with my sidearm always at the ready. I used the internet to try and figure out what could have been going on. I poured through information about candai, Canis lupus, Canis lupus familiaris, Canis lantras. I researched all of them. What I saw did seem like a wolf or coyote, but those eyes, those howls, they were just so unnatural and unnerving that I couldn't accept this. Then there was the picture, that blurry picture from my cell phone that showed what I could only pray was a trick of the light. It was as if only the creature exuded tiny tendrils made of shadow that writhed in the air around them. I could only hope that they were diseased or covered in wet and knotted hair. A part of me knew there wasn't such a clear-cut and simple explanation to this, however. Despite wanting to remain skeptical, what I had seen and heard led me to suspect there was something unnatural and supernatural about these things. Searches led to stories of barguests and black shuck, mythical black dogs that are said to roam the English countryside as harbingers of death. I hated to even imagine this as a possibility, that my own death was just slowly stalking me until the time was right, that my end was near. Trying to allay my fears, I posted the picture I'd taken on various forums, ranging from ones about wolves and wild dogs to those dedicated to the occult and supernatural. It seemed that every time I told my story, I was either met with ridicule or nutjobs who linked it all to ludicrous things like alien plots. I caught a few leads eventually in news reports. Stories started popping up from nearby towns of people committing an S-word or being attacked by wild animals. People who had reportedly heard sounds much like I had. The sites were spread apart and seemingly randomized, but I kept up my search for similar incidents. I had to find something that would prove to myself that I wasn't simply losing my mind. Sadly, all I could do was keep searching and hope to eventually find some sort of meaning to it all. Finally, 4 nights ago, my dream changed. After walking for so long, I could finally see the end of the road. I was horrified. A few hundred feet in front of me, the road simply stopped, vanishing into a wall of trees. In shock, I stood there, staring at the throng of old pines, wondering if I should turn back. I had scarcely a moment to think before I saw it. Out of the center of the mass of trees plodded a large, black, wolf-like creature, barely more than a shadow. Its eyes pierced the darkness as it eyed me. Behind those eyes was an unmistakable malice. Even more frightening, there was an unmistakable intelligence in them. I was frozen. After what seemed like an eternity, the beast sprinted at me. As the distance closed, I could see its body clearly covered in flowing black tendrils that flowed in the air as if its very essence was reaching out to devour all around it. Instinctively recoiling, I braced myself for the impact as it lunged at me, covering my stomach and neck to try and save myself. At the very moment in which I knew that everything was over, its haunting howl echoed through the night, and my heart was pounding in my chest as I woke up. My hand was already reflexing, gripping the pistol that I now kept under my pillow. Sitting upright, I was trying my best to catch my breath when I heard and saw it. Like a black smoke, it poured through one of the darkened corners of my room, almost seeming to suck the light from the area around it. As more and more started to creep in, I could clearly see those damned red eyes that were now dripping with blackened blood and a muzzle full of razor-sharp teeth starting to form. What happened in the next few seconds will be forever burned into my brain. I got off only 3 shots between the time it had formed and lunged on top of me. I remember in the back of my mind, I was shocked that it even had physical form as the impact knocked me backwards onto the bed. My gun was knocked out of my hand as it pinned me and pushed its muzzle towards my throat. Its eyes were burning flashes like cigarettes in the dark, leaving bright trails as it maneuvered for a good bite. With one hand, I gripped its throat with all my strength, fighting to keep its gnashing teeth from my neck. While struggling, the putrid stench of 1,000 rotting corpses assailed my lungs as its breath washed over me. With my free hand, I groped frantically across my nightstand in a state of panic for some kind of improvised weapon. I was keenly aware of the sensation that my entire body was going numb. Those writhing tendrils of darkness seemed to permeate my very flesh. Everywhere they flowed through my body felt like it was submerged in freezing water. I had lost all sense of feeling in my arm that held the creature at bay by the time my hand touched the base of a familiar metal surface. My touch lamp blazed to light. In an instant, the snarling atrocity which lumbered over me seemed to fade from existence. Nearby, I heard a loathsome howl that echoed through my ears like a curse, then dissipated into nothingness. It took hours for me to regain feeling in my arm and my body, but I laid there until morning in complete and utter terror. Had the light driven it back? Was pure luck the only reason I was now alive? I could scarcely believe that it wasn't all some sort of hallucination. I wish that it had been something as merciful as insanity. In bed, I remember pondering my situation, trying to put some sense to this all. 3 shell casings laid strewn across the floor, and there were no holes in my wall. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. It told me a few things, however. There was no blood, but that beast had been hit and I was able to touch it. The sudden bright light seemed to have driven it back, but I had heard it later, so I doubted that it was fatal. It had appeared out of the darkest corner, so it possibly needed to manifest in darkness. Oh yeah, it also stalked me in my fucking dreams and toyed with me, only to then follow me into my bedroom and try to rip my throat out. I had no clue what the hell it was. I felt like I would never know what was going on. I started leaving all my lights on all night and switched all of my bulbs to 100 watts. Saving power isn't exactly high on my list of priorities anymore. I've tried staying awake forever, didn't turn out too well, but I can't remember what I dreamed of those past few nights. That's something I really don't find myself regretting. I've heard it nightly, outside, howling, walking around on my porch. I don't think anyone can ever become accustomed to that accursed howling, but it doesn't completely paralyze me with fear anymore. It may not have been much progress, but it is something. Last night, I had a bit of a breakthrough, although it doesn't really help my current situation. I'd long assumed there wasn't any chance of actually getting a serious response in any of the forums I had visited and given bits of my story to. But last night, I received an email from an alleged government worker. It seems I'm not the only one with first-hand encounters. He has been dogged, if you forgive the pun, by these same beasts for some time now as well, but unlike myself, he was able to dig up some information from classified documents that I would have never been able to get into. At first, I was extremely skeptical, until I began to read through the information he had sent me. Too many pieces fit into place for it to be sheer coincidence or him making things up. Although it is a lot of data to process, I'll relay the story as it was told to me. Over the past few decades, dogs have been the focal point of myriad of scientific experiments. Soviet scientists, for example, used them extensively in their experiments, from studies of the effects of weightlessness on the body to attempts to preserve living organs outside the body. Some died in orbit as the first animals to ever travel into the blackness of space. Countless others died deep in underground labs under the surgeon's knife in countries around the world. Not all of them, however, remain dead. Dr. Peter Safar, the inventor of CPR, introduced a concept to the army that must have seemed laughable at the time. He suggested that you could keep a body in suspended animation for hours by replacing all the blood in a body with an ice-cold saline solution. It was shelved for nearly 2 decades. But again, eventually dogs were put on the chopping block in the name of science. Organs were torn and bones were broken, only to be repaired by the ones who did the damage. The saline was drained after hours of operation. Blood was reinserted into the corpses, and their hearts were jump-started. Safar was right. You could keep a patient in stasis for hours until they could be operated on, then resurrected. It was an astounding medical breakthrough, one that would soon be twisted into a blasphemous mockery of its original purpose. Despite many practical applications for saving trauma patients and wounded soldiers, this treatment is still not in widespread use, at least not as originally intended. The government decided to do what it has always done with new technology designed to benefit mankind. The decision was made to weaponize it. Once more, due to repeated successful reanimations, man's best friend was placed firmly in scientists' sights once more. Thus began the project, henceforth known as Kerberos Project. Whoever gave it this moniker likely thought it was extremely clever. If only they had known just how fitting their choice was. It was surmised that, while in this state of suspended animation, procedures which would almost certainly kill a living creature from shock could be carried out with significantly reduced risk. In this vein, the original plan was to test concepts on the canines, which would then be carried over to select active special forces troops if successful. One of the primary goals was to make physiological enhancements that would make the test subjects much more resilient in combat. Wolf dogs were selected as prime test subjects due to their oofed larger and sturdier frames that resulted from crossbreeding. The first test subjects were put under the aim of implanting subcutaneous body armor in the form of layered titanium plates, which would theoretically be able to deflect bullets. While many were able to survive this procedure, the scientists were completely unable to find an acceptable balance between weight and protection. Results varied from dogs who could not move under their own weight, which were slightly resilient to small caliber rounds, to dogs which were highly mobile, but statistically no more likely to survive small arms fire than a dog without the augmentations. Many subjects were lost to suffocation through their own weight, while the lightly armored dogs were simply put under, yet again, their armor removed. Eventually, the solution was to found it in sheets of carbon nanotubes, woven into a lightweight fabric that was both flexible and able to resist small arms fire. The resulting armor was a mere 0.6 millimeters thick and capable of flexing freely. An astounding 70% ratio of tested dogs survived the procedure and showed an astounding resistance to small caliber handgun and rifle rounds. Having proven the plausibility of a bulletproof super soldier, they began to focus on potential offensive enhancements to the animals. Again and again, the dogs were put into a suspended state and operated on. No real breakthroughs were to occur, however. Notions such as replacing claws and fangs with much sturdier and sharper materials resulted in the animals shredding themselves into grisly ribbons when they attempted to scratch themselves. It was in this period, however, that abnormalities started to make themselves clear. The wolf dogs that had been under the knife the most started to show signs of instability. They ran into the walls as if chasing an unseen foe. They snarled and growled at vacant corners. It seemed that prolonged and repeated death and reanimation has resulted, unavoidably, in brain damage. The decision was made to continue the studies and to see just how many times the dogs could withstand the process before they were unable to fully function. The symptoms became worse and worse. The dogs seemed to stare at things that were not there. Their ears began to twitch as if listening to sounds unheard, and speculation arose that the animals had begun to hallucinate as a side effect of brain damage. But the tests were not interrupted. In time, every single of the surviving dogs displayed erratic behavior to some degree. The ones that had been subjected to the most experiments had started to even show signs of a weakening vascular system. Their heart rate slowed to an almost death-defying pace, and their eyes began to fill with red as if all their capillaries had burst. Extreme cases began to develop where blood actually started to slowly pour from the eyes and nose of the animals. These cases were accompanied by an inexplicable darkening of the fur and behavior that, if applied to a human, would be classified as paranoid schizotypical behavior. Both fear and aggression were markedly increased. The dogs alternatively slunk from and or bit at anything around them, be it real or imagined. The order came down from the high brass that these red-eyed beasts were too unpredictable for practical applications or to even continue research on. Research was confined to an observation-only basis. Within a week, the first reports of howling on the base began. Dogs began to disappear from their cages, each time with no trace as to how they even escaped. All of the cages found empty had been magnetically locked, and there were no records that indicated loss of power. With each night, reports of strange howling grew as the numbers of subjects inside the lab dwindled. Sightings of black wolf silhouettes were reported by the guards, often seen vanishing around a corner to never be located again. The corpses started turning up on the fifth morning. 12 dead. In the nearest town, people were found dead in their beds, at their computers, and on their couches. Some had their throats ripped open. Others had their entrails devoured entirely. This was easily attributed to the escaped animals, but the most puzzling thing is that a few of the homes had been locked without any signs of forced entry. Frightened townspeople recounted hearing an ominous howling throughout the night that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. Some even reported witnessing strange movements in the shadows and claimed to have been stalked by creatures by dark, red, iridescent eyes. Within 16 days, all the remaining animals, totaling over 200, had inexplicably vanished from their cages. During this period, the omnidirectional nightly howling that pervaded the nearby countryside pushed people to their mental limits. Local police were inundated with calls from panicked individuals who had locked themselves in their homes, afraid to turn out their lights or even sleep until morning. It wasn't until the end of the third week that the death toll began to wane into nothingness. Reports of the eerie howling started to be confined to the most rural of homes before they stopped entirely. The total of missing and dead was tallied at 97, with 18 deaths attributed to S-word. Of the S-words, 4 were notable for happening in the victims' beds and for a complete lack of physical trauma or traces of known drugs or medications in their bloodstreams. In the end, non-disclosure agreements were signed by staff. The government wiped its hands of responsibility and claimed the incidents in town were due to a massive rabies outbreak. All data was classified as top secret and then filed away. This is basically the meat of the information he gave me. As far as I can gather from our correspondence, this happened originally in a remote location in Arizona, which was blacked out of the files. Given my location of rural South Carolina and the fact that I've only witnessed a few at most, I could only assume that most of these animals have branched off into small packs and been roaming ever since. Sadly, I can't do anything but speculate on the details of what really happened based on what I've seen. The conclusions I've drawn only serve to horrify me even more, but I can't think of any better explanations. These dogs were taken into the realm of death dozens of times, only to be ripped back into our world. What if, each time, they took a part of the realm of death itself back with them? It's as if they began to see and feel that which exists on both sides of the veil of death simultaneously, and it cracked their minds. They underwent this turbulent transformation into some sort of semi-physical manifestation of the other side, becoming literal avatars of death. Now, this transformation is complete, and they aren't broken-minded killers anymore, but stalking agents of the afterlife that like to toy with their victims before taking them down. At will, it seems that they can manifest out of the blackness and travel the void between both worlds, somehow neither truly alive or dead, but something in between. I don't know if they can be killed, but the light holds them at bay. Earlier, I gathered all of my courage when I heard my demonic stalker on the porch and confirmed this theory. I slowly opened the back door after I'd flooded the room with light. I locked eyes with the beast. He simply glared with hatred through the glass door. He made no attempt to press forward through the light. It was a horrific few moments, but I had to be sure that the light could have offered some protection. I now feel like a prisoner of my own home, but at least I'm alive for as long as I have power. One fear keeps repeating itself in my mind, though. What happened to the 4 reported dead in their bed with no explanations why? Did they reach the end of the same road that I did and simply never wake up? They're out there. They're hunting. The only advice I can offer is to keep your lights on and try not to dream. The man who followed. I used to live in the basement of my mother's house. Perhaps that's a bad way to begin this story. When I was 16, my mom and stepdad bought a new house. Since I've always hated Idaho's oppressive summer heat, I claimed the dark, cool basement as my bedroom. That was the first time I'd ever lived on the lowest floor of a building, so I promptly found a good, cheap, and horribly tacky waterbed on Craigslist. The thing had a headboard mirror out of a 1970s adult film, but the bed fit in the basement and it didn't leak. I immensely enjoyed sleeping on water, and I did not have a single night that summer where I woke up too hot or too sweaty. That basement wasn't really set up to be a bedroom. Whatever floor space my waterbed and drum set didn't take up was hogged by a gigantic coal furnace. The old thing must have heated the main floor of the house once upon a time, but no one bothered to remove it or the coal that it was filled with when a more modern heating system was installed. The concrete floor was covered in coal dust and dirt was sneaking into the house through the gap where the walls and floor attempted to meet. The ceiling was crisscrossed with pipes and revealed the supports for the upper floor through several large, jagged holes. To most people, It looked just like a shabby basement. To me, it looked like a scene out of a bad horror movie, which was excellent because I loved bad horror movies. As most of us know, the Earth tilts on its axis and eventually summer comes to an end. School started back up as it always did, and I settled back into my routine. This time equipped with a driver's license and an older Subaru. Since every parent I had, biological or step, worked a pretty packed schedule, they threw the car at me so that they would actually relax when they finally got home from work. I didn't complain. The independence of being able to shuttle myself from school to swim team practice, violin lessons, friends' houses, or anywhere else a tank of gas would take me was amazing. Driving was one of my favorite things to do until that winter. I'm not wasting your time with a story about snow. Sure, Idaho gets a lot of snow, but after some doing donuts in an empty parking lot, snow on the roads wasn't daunting. I knew my limits there. No, this isn't about snow. This is about being followed. That winter, I started getting followed by a man. At least, it looks like a man. In my rearview mirror, I would see him standing there at night. He would always be dark and shadowy, just the silhouette of a man wearing a long coat and a fedora. His hands stuffed in his pockets, leaning casually against a lamppost or a tree. No matter where I was, no matter how fast I drove, he was standing there, 20 yards behind my car. Every time I looked back. I've always been a nervous kid with an overactive imagination. I cracked it up to that. Perhaps if I switched from horror to romantic comedy for a month, he'd go away. Perhaps I really did see a man standing against a lamppost once, and it gave me the creeps enough to imagine him more often. I really wasn't sure. I did my best to ignore this figure, but I soon noticed myself leaving my friend's house early to avoid driving in the dark. I'd let other people drive when they offered, and if they did end up driving at night, I didn't look in my rearview mirror. Whatever was happening, it was starting to get under my skin. I really underestimated the thing that followed me. In hindsight, the key bit that I missed was why he followed me. If I had watched him closer, I would have seen that every night I drove home alone, he followed me further. At first, he could only follow me out of the neighborhood I was leaving. I started to really notice him when he followed me through downtown. He was always so dark in stark contrast with these city lights. When I stopped watching him, he followed me home. I let him follow me all the way to the basement, and I didn't even bother to keep an eye on him as it happened. I was curled up on my waterbed, slowly drifting off to sleep, when something disturbed the fluid that I was floating on. I thought to myself that it must be my dog, and tried to leave it at that. But the bed shifted back to normal. There was no mass displacing water other than me, so I sat up, and in the dark, I saw that man that had followed me into my basement. He stood there, staring at me, with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets and his face obscured by his fedora. In a childlike attempt to destroy the monster in my basement, I clambered off of my bed and pulled the thin cord dangling from the one bare incandescent light bulb in reach. Light flooded in the room except for the space the man took up. Much as he did downtown, he appeared shadowed despite illumination around him. As I gazed at the man, the entity that had followed me for months, I became aware that he stood between me and the only staircase that led out of the basement. So I ran. I ran directly at him. I would not let myself be trapped in my own room. I would not give up. If there was to be a fight, I would instigate that fight. I lowered a shoulder with every intention of hitting him in the diaphragm. Instead, my shoulder collided with the stairs behind him. Aside from the burning where my body met the stairs, I was cold. Painfully cold. I tasted metal in my mouth and I wanted to vomit. Turning around, I saw that the man was no longer there. I don't know what would have happened if I didn't rush towards him. I slowly climbed the stairs to the main floor of my mom's house. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe I'm going crazy. In hopes of calming my nerves, I poured myself a glass of water from the tap and sipped it as I leaned against the kitchen counter. I was shaking, but I was also slowly calming down. A feeling of triumph was building in my gut, spreading out underneath my skin. Did I just defeat my demon? Was I victorious? Even the gritty metal taste in my mouth began to subside. I can only imagine how I looked that night, a pale, frightened teenager trembling in the kitchen while the rest of the house slept. It was a pathetic, silly thing for me to picture. I laughed to myself. To my relief, the next few times I was caught driving home in the dark, I saw nothing strange in my rear view mirror. It's actually been a couple years now, and I don't see him anymore. But I can hear him. Whispers from the forest. When I was a kid, I used to live in this woodsy area in Vermont. There were a few other kids to play with, and my only sibling was still a baby, so I learned to play on my own. Throughout my time as a child, I spawned various imaginary friends to stave off the boredom I faced with little interaction with other children. Naturally, my curiosity got the better of me, and I began to explore the woods. There were trails that intersected and diverged all throughout the woods, and it wasn't uncommon to find other people walking along them. It did catch me off guard one day when I saw two other kids walking along the trail I was on. I was excited and went to meet them. One was a boy, Tyler, slightly older than me, and the other was his sister, Katie, who was slightly younger than me. They lived at a house about 10 minutes away from mine, but the only way to reach it was through the woods. Over time, we met and began to play more and more often. Tyler and I became good friends, and we started to leave Katie out of our fun a bit because she was younger and a girl. Of course, this upset her, and she began to hate me whenever I came over to play with her brother, but being the cruel children we were, it just added a bit of sadistic pleasure to it. Tyler and I began a makeshift map of the woods, using our houses as the central location. We searched quite a bit in all directions, and this tended to fill our days and went into the night. My parents, while happy I made a friend, began to worry over my venture into the woods and started to put time limitations on how long I could stay out. Tyler's parents seemed to agree with mine and sent Katie with us to make sure we listened. Katie was excited our first day out together, but ignored me almost entirely, only speaking up to argue with my suggestion of where to go next. After one particular vocal debate on her end, I snapped at her. She immediately teared up and ran away. I tried to chase after her, but Tyler grabbed my arm before I could take more than one step. "She'll just go back home. Let's keep going." I assumed he knew his sister better than I did and went with them. We explored out a bit until we hit a large river. We toyed a bit with the idea of crossing it, but relented when we saw the sun's position in the sky. It would be dark by the time we got back anyway. As we followed the map back to our houses, we made mental notes of what trees could be used to make rafts or what might be a faster route to the river. It was just starting to darken outside when we heard a voice. A young girl, and what sounded like an older man. We almost shrugged it off until Tyler bolted towards the noises. I tried to ask what was going on until I realized what he heard. The girl's voice was Katie. We kept moving until we came to a slight mossy rise overlooking the clearing where the voices were coming from. Deciding it would be stupid to just run in there, we flattened out on the rise and scouted out the situation. In the middle of the clearing was Katie, but there was no man. Katie was looking at something though. We just couldn't see from our vantage point. As we rounded the rise and went into the clearing, Katie became aware of us. She turned with a smile towards Tyler and a scowl towards me. She waved Tyler over, saying, "Come quick, meet my new friend, Bella, or was it Molly?" The male voice was heard again. It was a guttural sound that left ringing in my ears. Like whatever the noise was, it wasn't meant to be made by that throat. "The name is not important now, my dear, but I must leave now. We'll meet again soon, I promise." Katie rushed forward towards the trees at the opposite edge of the clearing, telling the man to stop. Tyler immediately went after her. I just stood there wondering what the hell that was. The thing wasn't human as far as I could tell. It was slightly higher than my waist. I couldn't see any details on it though besides its eyes, which were yellow, like a goat. It left after it finished its sentence and there was no sight of it. We never saw it leave, it seemingly just disappeared. Tyler and I were creeped out knowing this wasn't normal, but Katie thought it was some type of magical being like in Disney movies. In fact, she said that Bella told her that she could become a princess if she kept talking to him. And what girl didn't want to become a princess? Tyler warned her away from talking to the thing and threatened to tell his parents about it. It was an empty threat because we both knew that either his parents would think he was lying or that they would believe him and not allow him to go into the woods anymore. After that, we took a break from exploring for a few days, each of us trying to come up with an explanation as to what the hell that thing was and too scared that we might face it ourselves. Katie held no such apprehension and would sneak past her brother early to go into the woods. Tyler did tell his parents about that after the first few times she came back with trinkets, which were things made of animal bones or organs. Katie's parents forbid her from going into the woods without Tyler to accompany her, and so she pouted for a few days. One day, though, she came to us while we were at Tyler's house and excitedly told us about how Baldy came to her in the night and told her about how he was a prince and he would make her a princess if she came outside. But for some reason, he disappeared before she could go out. That thing's been coming here every night since we first saw it, Tyler said as soon as she left. What? I said, dumbfounded. Yeah, it walks around our house and then sits below Katie's window for a bit. Last night, it tried to open her back door, but I made sure it was locked before I went to bed. Well, how the hell did it talk to Katie then? I don't know, dude. But it was in Katie's room last night. I fucking ran to her room as soon as I heard it and it disappeared. I guess it only wants her. The story gave me goosebumps and I made sure not to wait until even dusk to leave for my house. The visitings continued and seemed to be progressing more and more towards Katie leaving with this thing. Tyler tried to tell his parents, now more concerned for his sister's safety than his ability to explore the woods, but they laughed it off as if he had an overactive imagination. We came up with a plan one day. I would stay over Tyler's house for the night, and we would trap and maybe kill the thing before it went any further. We gathered everything we could possibly need. We booby-trapped all entrances after his parents went to bed and stayed in his living room with knives from his kitchen nearby. We both must have dozed off as we were yanked awake by that thing's unnatural voice upstairs. A quick glance around showed that none of the traps went off, but somehow this thing was still inside. We grabbed our knives and ran upstairs. As we reached Katie's door, the creature never stopped talking. Still inaudible from our position, but it was clear what it wanted. Its voice almost had a gleeful tone. Tyler and I ran in without much hesitation, but were unprepared for what we met. It seemed like it might be a goat, but it stood on its hind legs. Its front legs ended in these gnarled, gray-skinned human hands, and its back legs ended in similar feet. Its rib cage was visible through its fur and skin, giving it a look of death, and it smelled like it had been rotting under a hot summer sun for weeks. It turned to us, but Katie didn't. She kept her joyful gaze on the creature the whole time. I see we have visitors. Would you like to come with us? The ringing followed the words instantaneously as if he had been hit in the head by something hard and heavy. Tyler charged forward and lunged at the thing with his knife. The knife landed but didn't go in. The blade bent and then snapped as Tyler went tumbling from the weight being shifted from his feet. Many have tried that, my child. I fear it is not possible to slay me with items of this realm. Tyler yelled for me to follow, but I was frozen by the creature's gaze. The thing slowly grabbed Katie's hand and led her out of the room. As it brushed by me, the smell of death overwhelmed me and I vomited. Tyler grabbed the knife out of my hand and chased after it. After a second of waiting, I followed him. It was already at the back door by the time I got down there. Tyler kept screaming to let her go and perhaps to alert his parents. Katie kept telling him to be quiet so she could go to her kingdom. And the creature, it just kept staring at us as it walked out the door without setting off the traps as it left. It seemed to be trying to remember what our faces looked like. I felt like it was looking at more than just our faces too. Perhaps our souls. Tyler followed them out, shouting Katie's name as the pair reached the shadow of the woods and disappeared. Tyler didn't even hesitate as he plunged into the darkness himself. I did the only thing I thought was sensible and tried to wake his parents up, who didn't hear any of the commotion from the events before. They were panicking as they called the police and went out into the woods themselves. I tried to make myself go into the woods to help the family find their child/sister, but I couldn't. The wrongness of that creature shook me to my core, so I just sat in their backyard, waiting in case Katie came back and trying to stave off thoughts of what would happen if that thing was with her. I sat for a while, hearing the increasingly distant shouts of people searching for her. My parents joined in and some other neighbors. The police did as well with some search dogs, but I just sat and waited. It might have been an hour or two before Tyler came back, and he was running that. "Where's the map?" he shouted as he broke through the forest. I don't know, what? He shoved past me and ran into the woods. He was tossing things around frantically, searching for the map. I saw them. They were heading towards that first clearing we saw that bastard in. I just forgot where it was, and I want to cut them off. I'll go with you, I finally choked out. Tyler barely nodded as he finally found the map. We set off towards the clearing we had marked out clearly on the map, if only to avoid it. The path we took was the fastest way, but rough because it didn't follow any actual trails. After collecting a fair amount of scrapes and bruises, we reached the clearing, where we saw them. The creature stood, eyes fixated on us. In the center of the clearing, Katie was slightly off to its side. "Let her go, you fucking piece of shit," Tyler yelled as he ran forward. I followed slowly, but I believe we both noticed the hole at the same time. It was about 4 feet in diameter and had some unnatural glow coming from the bottom, wherever that was. Whispers echoed in the clearing, coming from the hole, in all different languages, some not even human. "This is your carriage, princess." The ringing followed yet again. Katie looked into the hole, a sense of fear coming over her face. This doesn't seem right. Tyler had closed the distance and was futilely trying to attack the creature. Knowing that wouldn't work, he shifted his attention to Katie and tried to pull her away, but the thing's horrific human hand was wrapped around her waist and gave no sign of letting go. "Stop it, Tyler, you're hurting me." "Let go of her or I'll fucking gut you right now." The creature gave a curious look at Tyler, then glanced again at me. I have plenty of people down there, but no princess. This is how it must be. It stepped into the hole and dragged Katie down with it. Tyler tried to hang on, but the sudden pull of Katie made him lose his grip on her arm. Hot air pulsated out and blew both of us away from the hole. I hit my head on a tree and everything went black. I awoke to many people in the clearing, a few hovering over me, but most crowded around Tyler, who was feverishly telling them what happened in tears. No one believed him, even with the 4-foot circular burn mark in the grass. The following weeks, Tyler ignored me entirely. I think he blames me in part for my cowardice. I do too, to an extent, but I'm not sure what I could have done anyways. About 2 months after Katie's disappearance, I woke from a horrible dream about what was at the bottom of that hole. But then I heard the whispering. I steeled myself and looked out the window. It was Katie. She was at the edge of the woods in my yard. I slowly got out of bed and went downstairs to my back door. If I brought Katie back to Tyler, everything would be all right. Something was off about this, though. There was a ringing in my ears and faint whispers from the darkness of the woods. I opened the door and glanced out. Katie was now in the middle of my backyard, but the top of her head was missing. The edges of the hole seemed to have been made to look like a crown. She was horribly pale and her eyes were glazed over. I knew this wasn't Katie, or wasn't anymore. But the voice that came out was hers. Would you like to be my subject? Only take your left limb so you can be my jester, she said with surprisingly lively glee. I was about to turn and run when I saw the eyes of that damned creature sitting in the void of the woods. The setup reminded me of a fisherman in a lure. Katie noticed my shift of attention. Oh yeah, Belial's here. He wants you to come too. Don't worry, I forgive you for taking Tyler away from me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran to my bedroom and put the covers over my head. Sleep was hard to come by that night, and the whispers never stopped until dawn. Shortly after the sun came up, there was a knock on my front door. It nearly made my heart leap out of my chest. My parents answered it. It was the police, and they were hoping to ask me some questions. Have you seen Tyler recently? I truthfully said no. Tyler's gone missing as of last night. The only thing we know is that there's a note supposedly with his handwriting saying he went to be his sister's knight. Do you know what this might mean? I shivered but didn't bother trying to explain the events of last night. I wasn't sure if I had imagined them myself. My parents were terrified after that and moved within a week. We moved to a suburban town in southern Georgia, and things slowly became normal. Or at least my parents thought so. When I saw the new house, I begged my parents to find somewhere else. The house was only one level, and my bedroom is level with the ground. Every night, I hear whispers followed by tapping on my window. I've never looked. I refuse to. It's been 10 years since we moved, and this hasn't stopped. I would have gotten used to it if it wasn't for the fact that last night I heard a knocking on my bedroom door, and my parents are out of town. I can't do it anymore. The trees are watching me with 3 pairs of hellish eyes and whispering my name every night.